Well, I haven't made too many videos in the last few weeks, so I'm kind of trying to catch up here tonight. And some of the responses I got to my last two videos were actually quite interesting. And you know, people, you know, agree with me or they don't. I had an interesting response from a guy named Judd. I don't know what his actual screen name is, but anyway, he made some comments on one of my latest vids, basically trying to defend the position of Ron Paul in terms of economic policies and his vision about it. Okay, so he mentioned you know, not only the free market. What he tried to explain was that Paul's position is that essentially the free market, if it was actually free, would solve all problems. Essentially, that's the basic argument being made here, and I completely disagree with that, and I will tell you in a moment why. But from the outset, the premise for Ron Paul supporters or Peter Schiff or whatever, you know, and this guy is basically making that argument here, is that essentially the removal of Glass-Steagall regulations didn't go far enough. As a matter of fact, there should have been complete deregulation of the banking sector, of anything. Anything would be, the best thing to do is just to have no regulations at all over the market. So that is the crux of his argument. And my counter argument is, you know, on a very small scale, let's say in a small town or a small community, that kind of thinking, that kind of libertarian ideal might actually work. The problem comes in, we don't live in little unconnected communities anymore. We live in a global economy, and as such, this quaint little premise of everybody acting, you know, in their own self-interest, not trying to harm your neighbor, because obviously that is your immediate neighbor. You have to live in that community. That's a very, very different thing from the global market or the envisioned free global market, because essentially you're not answering to your neighbors. You have to answer to somebody very far away whom you will never see or personally meet. This kind of thinking ignores, for the most part, that part of human nature, and you know, there's good and bad parts. That part of human nature which is intrinsic to most of us. And those little bad parts are, you know, they include greed and avarice and revenge and malice and all of that stuff. But this kind of theory, basically, Paul's theory, leaves it completely aside. It leaves it out of this entire equation. And as I said in my counter argument to Judd, you know, after all, even if you're talking about the best scenario that you're putting out there, is that if banks were completely deregulated, okay, industries totally deregulated, then they would try to act in their own interest, because if things fail, you know, they would fail. Well, what's not mentioned here is that these banks and industries are run by humans, okay? And humans they don't act automatically or logically or necessarily in their own self-interest at all. In fact, there are quite a few emotional decisions involved, including in the market. Okay, nobody, if there was logic involved, nobody would panic. Okay, nobody would be screaming on the Wall Street floor if some fluctuation happens without going into panic. I didn't say that in my comment, but I think that's the flaw in this vision of libertarianism, which essentially posits that people, if they act in their own self-interests, are not going to cause too much harm all around, simply because they will be hurt themselves in the process. Now, on a theoretical level, this is all nice and fine, but on the practical level, it probably works out a bit differently. Because not everyone that acts in their own self-interest, has the notion in mind that they're going to be living in that community forever. In fact, things are quite mobile, and this human factor is left out of these theoretical economic equations. So that's basically my counter argument, because there's not much logic going on in the market, not even in the free market, if it actually were to be free. Okay? And I wanted to point out this little analogy to this commenter here, and perhaps he will just dismiss it and say, no, it's not the same thing. It's not. I mean, I can already anticipate it. You can't equate the market with traffic laws, but on a large scale, yes, actually I can. Okay, so here's my little analogy. So what these people, the Ron Paul people and Peter Schiff and all these sort of libertarian economists are arguing for is a complete deregulation of the market. And I'm not sure if they're for complete deregulation of anything else, but they are for the deregulation of the market. So let's say on a small scale this would happen in terms of that whole philosophy in your own city regarding just the traffic in the city. So the first thing in terms of deregulation that should happen is that you, number one, get rid of all stop signs, all stoplights, and you get rid of speed limits. And everybody can essentially just make up their own rules as they go along, presumably because out of self-interest, the bigger picture is going to be that nobody will lose. So, seriously, do you really believe if you're going to get rid of all regulations, just in terms of traffic alone? And by the way, financial transactions are also traffic, okay? So do you really believe that getting rid of all regulations, period, anybody just, is going to act in their self-interest and then it's all going to work out fine in the end? Do you really believe this is going to work out for the majority in the end? I tend to think that if you get rid of all traffic laws, all regulations whatsoever, you're probably going to see an increase in traffic fatalities rather than the other way around. And that's not to say that you have to over-regulate everything, but you do have to put some regulations in place. Now, if Ron Paul and Peter Schiff and this commenter of mine feel comfortable, driving through some of the streets in Bogota or Colombo, Sri Lanka, they're welcome to it. But what they will see is essentially some organized chaos that barely is even functioning. So all I have to say is, I don't hate Ron Paul supporters. I don't hate Peter Schiff and all these people who seem to have all the answers for us. I don't think they're evil people. Not at all. I just think that their prescriptions are actually going back to a time, close to the beginning of the 19th century, and that is not going to work in a global economy. And so this is why I'm against all this financial and economic globalism, because you cannot have an overriding authority over all this, and that is the market, and that is going to be the market. Because the market basically isn't everything that's valuable in life. What about people's dignity? What about labor? What about labor rights? Capital can move elsewhere. If they don't like the labor conditions in some country, and we're, basically, if you haven't figured this out by now, they're going to leave. They're going to leave and move to a cheaper labor market. And last I heard, 90% of the population on this planet are not the super rich, and they are not mobile. They can't just move to a different country, pick up their bags, and then when that goes bad, they pick up their bags again and move someplace else, as global capital is able to do. Now, don't get me started on this whole migration, labor versus labor, and all this stuff. And this is also part of it, but that should be a completely different subject, because it all ties into it, of course. But anyway, I just wanted to make my point, saying that deregulation of everything is a very bad idea. Very bad. Okay, on to the next video, I think.